Hello again, this is Mr. Liao, and these are the 2004 AP Macro FRQs. Number 1, assume that the U.S. economy is operating at less than full employment. Part A, using a correctly labeled AD and AS graph, show the following: full employment output, and current price level. So you have a recessionary gap because the economy is below full employment. So Y1 is where AD and SRAS intersect, and that's going to be below the level of potential real GDP, which is marked by LRAS and YF. Now the labels in this case don't matter because they didn't tell you to use a specific label. B, identify an open market operation that could restore full employment in the long run. Now remember, open market operation means the Federal Reserve or the central bank buying bonds or selling bonds. Since there's a recessionary gap, the Fed needs to enact expansionary policy, so they need to buy government securities or buy government bonds. One common mistake people make is that they miss the open market operation part and they'll say something like lower the discount rate or lower the reserve ratio. Those are not open market operations. Only buying and selling bonds are considered open market operations. Part C, using a correctly labeled graph of the money market, show how the open market operation you identified in Part B affects the interest rate in the short run. So on the y-axis is the nominal interest rate, quantity on the x-axis, downward sloping money demand, vertical money supply, intersecting at nominal interest rate R1. Since the open market operation is to buy government securities, that's going to increase the money supply, so MS shifts to the right, lowering the nominal interest rate to R2. So the interest rate goes down. D, explain how the change in interest rate you identified in Part C will affect aggregate demand. So the lower interest rate will increase interest-sensitive investment and consumption, which will in turn increase aggregate demand. This is something that we've seen many times. Part E, show on the graph in Part A how the change in the interest rate you identified in Part C will affect output and price level. So you know that aggregate demand increases due to the lower interest rate and the higher levels of investment and consumption. So AD shifts to the right. So real output increases, price level also increases. Part F, instead of the open market operation of Part B, suppose that no policy actions are taken to address the unemployment problem. With flexible prices and wages, explain how SRAS will eventually change. When you see flexible prices and wages, that's telling you in the long run. Because remember, in the short run, wages and input costs are fixed. So with lower wages or input costs, SRAS is going to shift to the right, restoring full employment. Now we're going to see what happens to output and price level. Since SRAS shifted to the right, SRAS shifting will lead the price level to decrease and real output to increase. 2. Assume that the national saving in the U.S. increases. Explain the effect of this increase on the real interest rate in the U.S. So this is a depiction of the loanable funds graph. Increases in national savings increases the supply of loanable funds. You don't have to draw the graph, you just have to explain. So increased savings increase the supply of loanable funds. So supply of loanable funds shifts to the right, thereby decreasing the real interest rate. B1, suppose that real interest rates in the rest of the world remain unchanged. Explain the effect of the real interest rate change in the US that you identified in Part A on the demand for the US dollar in the foreign exchange market. So here is the foreign exchange market for the dollar in terms of euros per dollar. Now the lower interest rates in the US will decrease capital inflow. Basically, money is not going to be coming to the US as much because remember, money flows to the higher interest rate. So that's going to decrease the demand by Europeans for US dollars. And demand shifts to the left, thereby lowering the exchange rate, depreciating the dollar against the euro. So that's the answer to Part B2. What's going to happen to the international value of the US dollar? It depreciates. And I just use euro per dollar. It can be any other currency. Part C, given your answer in Part B, indicate how U.S. imports and U.S. exports will change. So now that the U.S. dollar has depreciated, foreign goods are now relatively more expensive. So US imports will decrease. With a weaker dollar, Americans are less likely to buy overseas goods because the dollar does not go as far because it is weaker. So US imports, stuff being bought from abroad coming into the US, is going to go down. Meanwhile, US goods are now relatively cheaper due to the weaker dollar, so the US goods are more attractive to people that don't live here. So that's going to increase US exports because now that the dollar is weaker, for example, from Europe, people from Europe get more bang for their euro, so they can buy more American stuff because they're relatively cheaper. Number 3, the Federal Reserve buys $5,000 in bonds from Clark Consulting Services, which then deposits the money in a checking account at First Generation Bank. A, as a result of the Federal Reserve's action, what is the change in the money supply if the required reserve ratio is 100%? If the reserve ratio is 100%, the money multiplier is 1, so there is no growth. The only change in the money supply is the initial $5,000 purchase by the Fed of those bonds. So that is the only change in the money supply. Basically, the banks got to hold it all in. Part B1, if the required reserve ratio is reduced to 10%, calculate the maximum amount this bank could lend from this deposit. So the deposit is $5,000. The bank needs to keep 10% of it as required reserves, which makes $500 in cash, so the bank can loan out the remainder, which in this case is $4,500. They can loan out the other 90% of the initial deposit. Now let's look at the maximum increase in the total money supply from the purchase of bonds. So you can look at it in a couple ways. First, the money multiplier is 1 divided by the required reserve ratio, which in this case is 0.1. 1 over 0.1 is 10. So the bank can lend out the $4,500 that we saw in part B1. So you can multiply that by 10 for the maximum change in the money supply from the loans, which comes out to $45,000. So you have the $45,000 that are going to be new money because of the loans, but you also have the original $5,000 from the purchase of bonds by the Fed. All of that is money that is newly entered into the money supply. So the total maximum increase in the money supply by the initial purchase of bonds is the $45,000 plus $5,000 or $50,000. You could also think of it as this. The Federal Reserve bought $5,000 worth of bonds. Ultimately, that's going to be new money in the money supply. You can multiply that by 10 and you get the same $50,000. C, if banks keep some of the deposit as excess reserves, how will this influence the change in the money supply that was determined in part B2? Explain. So the increase in the money supply would be less than $50,000 or whatever answer you put for part B2 because the maximum expansion assumes that banks loan out all their excess reserves. If the banks keep some excess reserves, that's going to reduce the effect of the money multiplier. So even though the required reserve ratio is 0.1, let's suppose the banks want to keep 10%, an additional 10%, that makes the effective reserve ratio 20%, which reduces the money multiplier to only 5. Finally, part D, if the public decides to hold some money in the form of currency rather than in demand deposits, how will this influence the change in the money supply that was determined in part B2? So the idea is the money is loaned out to the public. The idea behind the maximum change in the money supply is all that money gets redeposited into checking accounts. If people are holding money as cash, that's going to reduce the effect of the money multiplier. So the increase in the money supply will be less than $50,000 because if people hold money as currency, that reduces the amount of reserves for banks that they can ultimately loan out. If you have any further questions, you can feel free to ask me in one of the many ways you can ask me.